Hi, I'm Jordan Mechner. Way back in the 80s, I made a game for the Apple II called Karateka. Now, 30 years later, I'm working with a small team to do a modern remake of that game, and I'm going to tell you how we did it. This is my storage room. So this is my first computer. The Apple II was still pretty new, so you couldn't actually buy a dust cover yet, so my mom sewed one for me. Look, she made little slots in the back so the cables could come out. There's a 16K Apple II. By now I think it's got 48K. You can see those keys are well worn. A lot of late nights coding when I should have been studying. And so this is the computer that I took to college, did all my term papers on it, and this is the computer on which I programmed Karateka. So there were kind of two ideas that sort of came together to become Karateka. One was the idea to do a game with smooth animation that would sort of feel cinematic, and the other was to do a game that had a story, that had a beginning, middle, and an end, a love story in which I would not only be trying to win, but also get to the happy ending, like a movie. Making a game in the 80s was very much a handcraft operation. I was the programmer, artist, animator, sound designer, all rolled into one. I spent 2 years making Karateka, and when the game was finished, I put it on a 5¼ floppy disk and mailed it to my favorite publisher, Broderbund Software. Broderbund accepted the game, and it was published in the fall of 1984. I was a junior in college. In those days, games didn't have marketing campaigns, but the game's popularity spread by word of mouth until, in May 1985, I opened Billboard magazine and saw that Karateka was the #1 best-selling game in the country. This is Karateka as it was finally published, and this was the game that started my career. When I made Karateka the first time on the Apple II, I was trying to make a game that was as visually and cinematically impressive as the technology allowed. So I thought that if I was going to remake Karateka now, I should make it the way that I would have made it in 1982 if I had had the tools that we have now, in a way that would be true to the spirit of what I tried to do on the Apple II. The challenge was we had these characters who were so simple that, they were 40 pixels high. The characters' faces were 4 pixels square. What would they look like in 2012?
There's a level of simplicity that I had to work with. I had a lot of talks with Jordan. He'd send a bunch of reference my way. I'd bring stacks of reference to him, and we'd just leaf through it. I like putting them all into shapes. You may never notice it, but when I design it, I'll think rectangle, inverted triangle. Of course, bodies don't fit perfectly into it, but that's the pillar that I use as I design.
The most important thing Jeff did was find the style that struck the perfect balance between the very simple cartoony graphics of the original game and those old Japanese woodblock prints, which are more visually sophisticated. It's not photorealistic, it's not Disney, it's its own thing. I loved the characters that Jeff drew. I loved the personality and the attitude that came through, but these were static drawings. How could we bring those drawings into the game and keep that freshness and spontaneity? How could we bring those drawings to life? Hi, I'm Jordan Mechner. Way back in the 80s, I made a game for the Apple II called Karateka. Now, 30 years later, I'm working with a small team to do a modern remake of that game, and I'm going to tell you how we did it. I wanted Karateka to have really smooth cinematic animation, but the thing is I was not a trained animator. I could draw okay, but when I tried to animate my drawings, it just didn't create an illusion of life at all. There's no other way to say it. It looked like programmer art. I decided to try a trick early Disney animators had used called rotoscoping. Rotoscoping is basically filming live actors doing the moves that you want to animate and then literally tracing each frame to get a frame of animation. In the 90s, I did a game called The Last Express, and for this, we actually developed a digital rotoscoping process. It kind of created the illusion of a pen and ink drawing come to life, and we did that for thousands and thousands of frames. This was 1982. This was before CDs, this was before hard drives, this was before videotape. What I had was a Super 8 camera. I borrowed my parents' camera, and I filmed my mom's karate teacher doing the moves that I thought I would need to make Karateka. That first roll of film of my mom's karate teacher, unfortunately, has been lost, but I've got the second roll of film. I realized that I would need additional footage, so I got my dad and my sister to model this footage out in front of our house. I also filmed myself running in a karate outfit. That footage didn't look so good, so I didn't use it. This roll of film was the beginning of the Karateka rotoscoping. Now, the next step was to project the Super 8 film and trace each frame individually on tracing paper. Today, of course, anytime you pick up your cell phone and shoot video, you're actually digitizing. It happens instantly at the touch of a button. We don't even think about it. But back then, I had to do it pixel by pixel. So I did this for every third frame of film, which gave me, I believe, 6 frames a second. This took a very long time. It was an incredibly laborious process. It took me months to go through all these steps just to get to the point of doing the first animation test. But I can still remember the thrill that I felt on seeing that little figure moving across the screen. It was the illusion of life. It was everything I'd hoped for.
Jeff gave us these amazing illustrations, and it came to the job of the character designers to actually translate those illustrations into things that could play and fight.
It's pretty easy to imagine a version of Karateka that would just be a sprite-based game where instead of my original 8-bit characters, you would have Jeff's drawings. That would totally have worked, but I didn't want to do that. The original Karateka was a side-scrolling game because it had to be. Even though it would have looked like the original game, I felt that wasn't really the most interesting way to try to bring Karateka into the modern day. I wanted the new Karateka to feel cinematic to today's gamers, and to make a great game in 2012 requires a great team. That's why I joined forces with Liquid Entertainment.
We were given the task of bringing these characters to life. Being a fan of Karateka, I was jazzed, I was excited. I knew we had to get these characters right, especially Akuma. This is the Darth Vader of the game. I mean, come on, we have to make sure we got him right. We looked at all forms of reference materials, ranging from real-world martial arts to Chinese fantasy to Japanese horror to us bouncing around with some cameras here in the studio.
Killing me.
We created a lot of material, but the question was, would it work for Karateka?
So early on, they sort of ran me through the course of the game. Some stuff is animated, some stuff isn't animated, and sometimes characters are just sort of like moving through space, like straightforward. They're not really running, and you're like, it'll get better, it'll get better. It's like watching the rough cut of any movie. Like it's gonna be fine. It's gonna be great. You talk about a vertical slice. A vertical slice is when you sort of fully animate one little section of it, so you can see what the whole thing feels like. And the forest was one of the sections that got built out kind of early. There's some leaves that are falling, and you see like the light coming through the trees in the right way. It's like, oh, that's what the game's gonna feel like. So let's get everything up to that level.
Jeff Matsuda's 2D character concepts began to assume three-dimensional life. Our next step was to bring the entire world of Karateka alive with sound and music. Hi, I'm Jordan Mechner. Way back in the 80s, I made a game for the Apple II called Karateka. Now, 30 years later, I'm working with a small team to do a modern remake of that game, and I'm going to tell you how we did it. Music in 1982 was not a big part of games. I knew from early Disney animation and silent movies how important music was to tell a story and make it emotional. But I wasn't a musician. So I turned to my dad. He was a businessman, not a professional musician, but he was a really good classical pianist. He suggested using Wagner's leitmotif approach, also used in movies like Star Wars, in which each character is represented by a musical theme. Of course, when he agreed to compose the music for Karateka, I'm not sure he really understood just how severe the technical limitations of the Apple II were. This was before sound cards. The Apple II had a built-in speaker, but I couldn't play instruments. All I could do was play tones at different pitches, and every time you played a note of music or a sound effect, you had to freeze the on-screen animation while the sound was playing. You couldn't have both at the same time. He'd write out the themes for Mariko and the hero and Akuma on sheet music, and I'd calculate the hexadecimal note values and type them into the computer. I remember playing the music back for him, and he'd say, well, this note here is it's a little bit sharp, and I'd bring it down one, and he'd say, well, now it's a half tone too flat, and so I'd bring it up one, and then he'd say, well, now it's a quarter tone sharp, and I'd say, Dad, this is a computer. It's a number from 0 to 255. There's nothing in between. It was primitive, but it worked.
Fans of the original game will notice several themes making an appearance in the remake. And it's very easy to do that because, frankly, the music written for the original game was very good.
For the new Karateka, music needed to be an even more essential part of the game. Modern fighting games often have controls that are really complicated. I wanted to keep Karateka simple, like the original, so that anybody could pick it up and immediately understand what they were supposed to do. This led me to what's probably the biggest departure of the new Karateka, and I think it's something that may surprise a lot of players. Fighting in the new Karateka is rhythm-based. It's halfway between a fighting game and Guitar Hero. You need to anticipate your enemy's attack patterns and block each punch or kick in the correct rhythm. And when you've done that, you earn your counterattack, and then you get to pound on him.
All good game music tells the story on some level, but this one tells it a little differently. It's almost a play-by-play of the combat itself.
You can actually close your eyes and hear what's happening through the music alone.
In terms of how you create a score like this, I pulled together some of the best musicians around who play traditional Japanese instrumentation. And I said, just go to town, guys. Lay down some fast drumming, some slow drumming. Let's record some chapa, which are hand cymbals, basically. I mean, all sorts of things. Little shots here and there of sound. It was very modular. Compiled a whole library of these things, that we could lay in at certain points, and they could even be randomized to a certain extent. I mean, we had a whole collection of material that is on the fly assembled by their audio engine and that adapts to what the player is doing. I think it's particularly cool that we started in this place where the game could only play sound or show motion. We've gone from there to this point now where the music is in fact so closely linked to the action that the action basically determines the musical composition. This one game, this one franchise sort of encapsulates that entire progression from what we were getting on the Apple II to what we're getting now.
Music and animation are really important to the game experience, but ultimately a game is about playing, that challenge that makes you want to keep trying and not give up. The original Karateka was a short game that took a long time to master. So how could we translate that to 2012? Hi, I'm Jordan Mechner. Way back in the 80s, I made a game for the Apple II called Karateka. Now, 30 years later, I'm working with a small team to do a modern remake of that game, and I'm going to tell you how we did it. The original Karateka took about half an hour to play from beginning to end, if you didn't lose a single fight. That was the catch. There were no 3 lives, no respawns. If you died, you had to start the whole game over from the beginning, and there were lots of ways to die. This is how a 30-minute game kept gamers entertained for days, or weeks, in 1984. Today, games are a lot more forgiving, but this actually makes my job as a game designer harder. Not because I want games to be hard, because in a story, if the hero dies, the story is over. It's a tragic ending, And if the game just ignores that and keeps going on, it takes me out of the story. It breaks the fiction. That's why in the original Karateka, I limited the player to 1 life. Because you're just one guy, flesh and blood, fighting an entire army. If you lose a fight, it really is over. But that was the 80s. I would never get away with that today. The new Karateka is the story of 3 suitors, all in love with the same beautiful princess. You always start out playing as Mariko's true love, the one she really hopes will rescue her. But he's physically the most vulnerable of the 3 suitors, the scrappy underdog. When you play Karateka the first time, odds are, eventually, you're gonna lose a fight. And when you do, that's it, the guards throw you off the cliff. But now the second suitor, a monk who's renounced his vows for love, takes up the fight where the true love left off. The monk is a stronger fighter. He has more hit points, his attacks do more damage. So that guard who beat you as the true love, you can actually beat him as the monk and keep playing. But eventually, even the monk might meet his match. And that's when the third suitor steps in, the most powerful of all, the brute. He has no karate style to speak of, just enormous strength. He's almost invincible. So you have 3 lives, but they're 3 different lives. And each one would need his own musical signature.
In terms of the enemies that you fight, in general, they're all represented by the whole orchestra. But as you get further and further along in the game, the orchestral forces that you fight, so to speak, get larger and larger. Earlier on, you're fighting maybe the first boss, and you're dealing with a string orchestra coming back at you. By the time you get to Akuma and the climactic final battle, you've really got this epic full orchestral sound coming at you, and it sets up a kind of a cool dynamic, the solo instrument versus the large orchestra.
That was our guiding philosophy. All of the design choices, from the music and art and animation style to the way the game handles failure, were all made to align the gameplay with the story. Even if you're new to the game, you have a good chance to rescue Mariko as the brute. But when you do, you realize he's not the one she really hoped would carry her off into the sunset. You won the game, but this isn't really the happy ending that Mariko was dreaming of. So you immediately want to go back and try again, to try to win the game as one of the earlier suitors. And all this time, your mastery is growing. The ultimate achievement, the one that unlocks the happiest, most triumphant romantic ending, is to rescue Mariko as the true love. And if you can do this, that means you've played through the entire game without losing a single fight. Just like on the Apple II.
The legend begins long ago, in a simpler time. The evil warlord Akuma kidnapped the princess Mariko, holding her captive in his fortress. From this despair, a hero was born, a karateka. I was his sensei.
Low kick, middle kick, high kick. Always punch the hawk.
His fighting was remarkable for its time. With Akuma defeated, our land was safe once more. I can fish, I can read, I have time for gardening, I wrote a play. Now, The darkness has returned. Akuma has captured our princess again. Where one hero stood, 3 are now forged in his spirit. True love. His passion is his strength. Good. The monk, he is righteous and determined. Oh, it's Punch the Hawk. The brute, he is very, very large. Seriously. One of these heroes must save the princess. Only you can guide them. This is the way of the Karateka.